If you were going to say to me, Kyle, why can Islam Makhachev win again against Charles Oliveira at UFC 294 in the main event, defend his title in their rematch, I would say
I eat, I sleepy, and I train.
simply watch their first fight again. However, if you were going to say Charles Oliveira is the underdog, how can he win this fight compared to their first fight? What does he need to do different? What are the signs you can point to as to why Charles Oliveira can beat Islam Makhachev the second time around? Now, that's a bit more of a difficult question.
Oh, don't cry, are you?
As part of this Devil's Advocate series, I knew I was going to be doing this one. So I, of course, went back and watched Charles Oliveira versus Islam Makhachev 1, and it's a tough one. It's a tough one to make an argument for, I'm going to be honest. Because you go back and watch that fight, and you try to point at where Charles had success, and to be honest, he kind of didn't throughout the majority of the fight. All of the things that you look for as potential successes for Charles Oliveira didn't really come to fruition, and we will dive into why those things happened and what he can do differently and what we've seen from him in the past to make it suggest that he can do things differently to change the outcome of this fight compared to their first meeting over, I think, about a year ago, right? So let's talk about it. The biggest saving grace in arguing for Charles Oliveira in this fight, I think, is not the first fight with Islam Makhachev, which we will dive into in a minute. It is his last fight against Beneil Dariush, a fight that I think a lot of people predicted Beneil to win. Because of how dominant Islam was against Charles, you get a bit of recency bias, maybe you forget. And also, Charles Oliveira, there's no strange rumor or anything like that. Everyone knows that his jiu-jitsu is the best part of his game, right? His striking has come a long way, but that jiu-jitsu threat is what allows him, I think, to be such an effective striker. Not that he doesn't have great technique, because he does, but the submission threat is his main weapon. And Beneil Dariush is a phenomenal grappler. He's got power in his hands. I think a lot of people had Beneil Dariush winning that fight. I think I might have done as well, which is crazy because I'm a huge Charles Oliveira fan. I was absolutely gutted when he lost to Islam Makhachev. Not that I don't also love watching Islam at work, because he is fantastic. But the Beneil Dariush finish, first round, takes him out ruthless. We've seen Charles Oliveira be ruthless against top lightweights many, many times in his title run and pull off a submission or a TKO as soon as that moment opens up. The Michael Chandler fight springs to mind, where he lands that one shot and hurts Chandler, and Chandler is notoriously difficult to put away, and Charles Oliveira didn't give him a second to even recover. It was a fantastic finish, and one that I have watched hundreds of times. I love that fight to bits. But this finish over Beneil Dariush had a confidence about it that we haven't seen from Charles Oliveira before, I don't think. Of course, his championship reign was fantastic. However, there was a lot of questions, not necessarily about Charles as a fighter, but there was obviously a lot of questions thrown at him because of some of the losses earlier on in his career, where he's accused of quitting and all of these kinds of things, and he proved in those title defenses that he has got heart and that he doesn't quit. But he would also oftentimes be losing those fights until he finished them. Not always, but a lot of the time he would take some big shots, and whether he would get dropped or whether he would go down to try and entice people to chase after him is difficult to measure. But those fights were competitive whilst they lasted until Charles got the finish. However, Beneil Dariush, he just looked ruthless, and the whole walkout, the whole vibe, it was like Charles Oliveira knows he's a superstar and he is back to prove that he belongs at the top of this division and that he isn't going anywhere. And that confidence, I think, will be huge going into this rematch with Islam Makhachev. Because, as I said, he didn't really have a lot of success against Islam the first time around. And let's break that down. So, Let's talk striking first, because if you were saying how can Charles Oliveira beat Islam Makhachev, I think you would probably say striking would be the first bullet point, submission would be the second. We'll dive into why that is. But Islam Makhachev looked better at striking in his fight against against Charles, than we've ever seen before. I've constantly heard about how Islam's striking is underrated and things like that, and I kind of agree to some extent, but I did think it was getting blown a little bit out of proportion ahead of that fight. But he impressed me massively in that fight, and of course against Volkanovski as well. I thought his striking looked great. So that will likely improve yet again when he faces Charles Oliveira. But we're not here to argue for Islam Makhachev. He is the favourite for a reason.
Hey, come on now.
It proved he needed to change something. He had been fighting in such a similar way throughout his title defenses, right? Everyone knows by now, because those fights were all incredible. He would walk into range, he would let his hands go, and he would just throw. He would be throwing everything to hurt you. He'd be throwing knees, then he'd be throwing elbows, then he'd be throwing kicks, then he'd be throwing... Like, it was constant, right? And it was to get people to panic, to get them to throw back and make mistakes, so he can look for submissions or he can look for that shot, you know? And it didn't work against Islam, because Islam isn't interested in brawling. Poirier, you can get him into a brawl. Gaethje, yep. Chandler, yep. And it just didn't work against Islam. He was like, I'm not going to be involved in this at all. And I think that was a big lesson for Charles Oliveira, and it's something you can draw on for the Beneil Dariush fight, because even though, again, he was, throwing the kitchen sink at him, it just seemed a lot less car crash and more calculated to some extent. It was still a little bit car crashy, but that's not me criticizing his technique. I think his technique is fantastic. It's just he throws everything, constant offense, and I think that needs to change in the rematch, and I think he can change that, and I think he can prove that he is a very technical striker. I think part of the game plan was to make Islam back up, and I think he can take a lot of lessons from Volkanovski in his fight with Islam, who of course came very, very close to beating Islam and did beat him in some people's eyes. He can play it more strategic. I don't think he has to rush Islam at all times. The other part of it, the submission, as I said, kind of the second point, I think a lot of people were like, okay, this is going to be interesting to see how Islam's incredible wrestling matches up with Charles's jiu-jitsu, kind of like the same argument we had for years with Tony Ferguson and Khabib. Khabib is so good at controlling people and beating them up on the ground, but how will he do against the unorthodox, creative jiu-jitsu of Tony Ferguson? And my favourite fighter of all time is Tony Ferguson, and I always said he ain't going to be able to do a lot of that stuff if Khabib just controls him. And there was glimpses where it looked like Charles Oliveira might be able to make something happen, but Islam was just so focused and calculated at all times that he was always safe, and then started to do work on the ground. And Charles welcomed him to the ground, and I think Charles was probably a little bit surprised that Islam was willing to play that game.
All his opponent, they scared to go with him to ground, That's why he pressure all his opponent. But when the fight beginning, if he come to try to push me, I'm gonna take him down. I'm gonna stop him. He feel comfortable, but I'm gonna change everything.
He knows now that Islam will play that game and that he can safely do it. I think that allowing Islam to grapple him, accepting a bottom position or a not as favourable position so that he can look for a submission, I hope that Charles now knows that he can't maybe get away with that against someone who is so calculated and dominant on the ground like Islam Makhachev is, who just rarely makes mistakes and is so good in positions. I think that was a mistake that he made as well. All in all, I've started by talking about the confidence of Charles Oliveira after that Beneil Dariush finish, and I think he had a lot of confidence in the first fight, but I think some of it was misplaced as to how he could beat Islam, and I think some of that got a little bit exposed because he kind of seemed to run out of ideas by the second round, if we're being honest. I don't think Charles Oliveira quit or anything like that, but I just think he didn't maybe have another plan. It was the same kind of game plan that he'd used for all the other opponents to some extent. Of course, he would have had setups and things like that he would have been drilling in camp, but it was all action, all offense, and then if he wants to go to the ground, welcome him to the ground and try and get a submission. And I think he has the skill to fight differently. Because he didn't always fight this way. Of course, he's been incredibly successful fighting this way, but styles make fights, as we all know, and I don't think that style works particularly well against Islam Makhachev. I can't wait for this rematch. I know a lot of people were like, really, again? But I love watching Charles Oliveira. I think that his style is really interesting against Islam. I hope that it isn't like the first fight, because the first fight was just dominant. And that is the worry, that it goes the same way and that it was a waste of time. But we will see. Like I said, I think Charles Oliveira has the ability to adapt and cause Islam some different issues to the first fight a year ago. That is it. The main event of UFC 294 on October 21st in Abu Dhabi. Let me know in the comments below, where are you guys thinking this matchup is going to go? Do you think it'll be any different to the first fight? Do you think Charlie Olives can pull it off? I love Islam Makhachev, but I kind of hope so. But we'll see. Like I said, let me know, and I will catch you on the next video. Enjoy the fights.
Name of the champion is Charles Oliveira.
One thing.